clear that it was going to be a messy process, and it was also clear from the beginning that it was an extremely complicated process, and I think we and our clients saw the need to find some common ground to avoid a costly fight, and I think there were many areas of common ground, recognizing the need to protect Raleigh's drinking water supply and also water quality in the lake, but also balancing economic benefits and that sort of thing as well. So we worked together, and I think came out with a decent product that allows a relook before the final stage of the rules goes into effect, and anything that goes into effect looking out to 2036 or 2041, whatever that final date in the rules is, needs a relook. That's a long time, if anything, particularly in a changing field like environmental management.
Our driving concern was the quality of our drinking water. And that's not the same as nutrient quality in the water of the lake for the whole lake. And that became an important issue as we tried to find some common ground. I think most of us were surprised at how impaired parts of the lake were and in what good condition other parts of the lake are. Falls Lake really, because of some highway causeways, really functions almost as three separate lakes in series. And the water quality condition of those three separate lakes is very different, and their susceptibility to problems from nutrient overloading is very different. Fortunately for Raleigh, the lowest part of the lake, or the most eastern part of the lake nearest the dam, is where we drink. And it's the part of the lake that's in the best condition. And so we were all starting from this point in time or place where the water quality was in pretty good condition down at our end of the lake. We're worried about adding drinking water supply. We have one major water treatment plant. We have a small one we just added last year. And we have not used all of the available water that we have been purchasing since 1972, even before it was built, the water supply that's available out of Falls Lake. And so we intend to expand that, and we were looking at, when we add on to our water treatment plant, do we have to add advanced treatment technologies to remove nutrient impacts on the water, or can we use more of the same type of treatment technology that we now use? And that nutrient loading of the lake and the future of the nutrient loading of the lake, and when and if it would reach the lowest part of the lake where we pull the water out, was really a critical piece of information. For the city of Raleigh, at the present time, we estimate it would cost us at least $125 million in additional cost to upgrade the treatment plant beyond the upgrades we would otherwise make to add more water capacity. So those kind of became the drivers for Raleigh in this process. At the same time, we were looking at numbers that told us that with present information, present technology, it's virtually impossible to expect the part of the lake that's above I-85 and closest to Durham to ever be cleaned up to meet water quality standards. So those were, for me, framing background pieces of information that became really important in sitting down and trying to figure out some common ground.
I guess the thing I would say about Falls is all of that effort that went on in the legislature around Jordan served to do two things. First, it made all of us, especially me, not want to go through that again. And secondly, we really felt like we had come up with a good solution on this new thorny problem of existing development. So when Falls came along, we said, hey, we got one of the hardest pieces of this figured out. And the consensus that was reached among the local governments was that all of the local governments would support the Jordan approach to existing development that had just been worked out in the Falls watershed. And it took us a little while to get the Division of Water Quality to kind of get exactly where we needed to be on that, but we had a great working relationship with them, and that's where we wound up.
I think that there was a progression. Raleigh and Durham had the chance to work together in the last legislative session on some legislative matters regarding Falls Lake. And that was tense at times. But we did work together. We basically, Durham agreed to certain tighter provisions on sedimentation, erosion control, and some other things in the Falls Basin. But I have to say, Durham wasn't happy about this because we felt a little ambushed in the legislature. We were, we sort of struggled to get an outcome that we could live with, but the outcome wasn't something that we were all singing about or feeling great about. At that point, the rules, I think, had sort of gone through about, I don't know, maybe 50%. There had been a lot of stakeholder meetings and whatever, but they still weren't anywhere close to their final form. And there was a lot of advocacy that went on, both separately from Raleigh and from Durham, and trying to shape those rules in a way that we could live with. But behind the scenes, there was also a discussion amongst the affected jurisdictions. And I think that this issue of the lower lake and the upper lake became, I think, the primary issue that we started focusing on prior to the end of the rural development. And that was an idea, I think, that came out of our attorney collaboration and continued discussion. And actually, I think, Steve, you in particular, were the proponent of that approach, and I think it was brilliant. And that was to recognize that the lake should be treated somewhat separately or differently, depending on whether you were dealing with the lower lake, which was directly impacting Raleigh's drinking water, or the upper lake. And that was, I think, a very important piece of this consensus that we reached. Notwithstanding the fact, however, that we reached that consensus and then actually negotiated with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in a meeting with very high-level decision makers there, and got them to actually backtrack some and present the rules in a different way. Notwithstanding the fact that we had achieved that, there was quite a bit of tension still, and then we had what I was talking about earlier, this meeting with a lot of local governments represented, and Durham and Raleigh clearly on opposite sides when it came to the issue of how much was Falls Lake deteriorating, what measures were necessary to address Falls Lake. And at that point then, I think it was our elected officials that helped draw us back together and get us all on the same page. And then we continued to work together, and we did that within this framework of these consensus principles that we probably hammered out in the space of less than a month, I would say. There was a lot of drafting, behind-the-scenes drafting by these attorneys. We had emails, 5 emails a day going back and forth. What could we agree to? What would we not agree to? A lot of negotiating, and those consensus principles then became the basis for our future collaboration. But I would have to say, this was not like one uneven, wonderful, collaborative approach. This was something where, we continued to meet. We met probably, I would say last year, we were meeting through most of the year, at least every 1 to 2 months. But there was tension in that meetings. There was lack of agreement about certain things. And like I said, at different points, I think things would break down. And then it did become important, I think, that the elected officials at this later point helped bring us back together. Notwithstanding the fact that we then agreed on the consensus principles, there were other things that were not addressed at all within these consensus principles. And so each jurisdiction went forward separately, still advocating its own point of view with regard to how small a lot should we be putting stormwater controls on? Should we be dealing with half-acre lots or 1-acre lots? Things like that were basically left open for everybody to advocate for themselves. So these consensus principles became the foundation for, I think, our advocacy on the very important principles, but we still continue to do our own advocacy on things that were of individual concern to us.
When a water body is out of compliance with its standards, then the state is required to put it on a list that's then approved by EPA, and Falls Lake was going on the 303D list. The issue was would the whole lake go on, or would only 2 parts of the lake go on, and the last piece not go on? And to show you how close it was, John, you'll have to help me if I get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure that we were like, you have to have more than 10% or more exceedances of the standard from the number of samples taken. We were at 9.5 in the lower lake. And DWQ rounded that up to make it an exceedance at 10. The initial decision was it wouldn't be listed because it was more than 10%. And they looked again at the language of the statute and it was 10% or more. And so they rounded it up. And certainly there could have been some public confusion. Raleigh strongly supported having the whole lake put on the list at one time. We thought it was an important statement about the precarious water quality condition of the lake, the need for something to be done. But it also allowed me to say to Mayor Meeker and the Utilities Department to say to Mayor Meeker, the lower lake's in really pretty good condition, and you don't need to be worried. If we can control and stop more loading of the lake and begin to reduce the amount of loading that's now occurring, then you're going to be safe to plan expanding your water treatment plant without adding that expensive advanced treatment technology. And that was a very important issue to the city of Raleigh. And of course, we could say to our public, our drinking water supply is in great shape. That big problem of pollution is pretty far up the lake and is pretty isolated from where we are. So I think that was a big part of what was important to Mayor Meeker and our council, and that was how we began more and more to approach and educate our council about these issues and try and educate our public about the issues, that the lake really was functioning as a multi-unit water body, not as a single water body, and you couldn't look at the high signal above I-85 and translate that into an immediate threat to the drinking water for Raleigh.
We're certainly in a future growth area in Granville County, southern Southern Person County, and we realized that although I'm sure Raleigh and Durham had all good intentions, we needed to be represented there and make sure we weren't squeezed out of the process as well. And I hope we were able to contribute something useful to that conversation. Sometimes I think we were sort of in the middle and took a more moderate position at times, and I think the final outcome, it helped to have various parties throwing ideas around. But we have real concerns about our ability to grow in southern Granville County and southern Person County and do it in a quality way because of the lack of wastewater capacity and the cost involved. And that's why we understood that there was an impairment in the lake that needed to be addressed, but we also wanted to be very sure that before the much more strict phase 2 rules are implemented, that there would be a relook.
From the Raleigh perspective, one thing I would add to what I said earlier is we also had the dose of reality that we are upstream from somebody as well. And as much as we wanted to have aggressive standards for the people upstream in Falls Lake, we knew that we were inviting those kinds of standards to be urged on us by the people who drink from the river below us, and reasonably so. So we were looking for some tempering, if you will, of what might be the full scope of the regulatory demand. And the Clean Water Act doesn't have much in it about economic feasibility. The Congress didn't really seem to care much about what it would cost to achieve these goals. It said, go do them. But we care a lot what it costs. So we're looking for that balance point to an extent, and that was an important issue for us in how effectively can we retrofit. We have some limited retrofit to do. We recognize we're already in a TMDL, total maximum daily load, that's been in place since '02. For the lower Neuse, Raleigh is the primary discharger for the lower Neuse, as the whole thing goes. We're a third plus of all the discharges that goes into the whole lower Neuse from Falls Dam to Newbern. And so if there's going to be retrofit required in the lower Neuse, and we know that in the Glen is I'm the chair, so you also see this element that at least is apparent in North Carolina. There are a lot of connections among the people. So I'm the chair of the Lower Neuse Basin Association, the Neuse River Compliance Association. Glenn is my lawyer for those two associations.
He's a lawyer. As you can tell. But anyway.
But regardless, we knew from information coming back to those two associations that the Lower Neuse has made improvements, and certainly big improvements have been made in areas like wastewater treatment by the wastewater treatment plants, and less improvement has been made in areas like stormwater, and the basin as a whole has not had a great deal of reduction in nutrient loading despite 10 years of effort and a lot of money spent. So that translates into someday the TMDL is going to be tinkered with in the Lower Neuse and tell Raleigh to do retrofits of its city, just like the Jordan process and the Falls process are telling Durham to do retrofits. We had an idea of what they cost. We have an idea of their complexity. So that all also goes into, I guess, the collective thinking of all of us as local government representatives, and what's an effective way to get there, but what's a way that also has some practicality and costing in it.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm not sure how much visibility you really want into the details of how this product got produced. But I guess if you ever want to be a part of doing one of these, at some point you need to understand it. And first of all, it bears saying, John, what is this, a 70 pages or so of rules? So this is a 70-page single-space document that we're talking about, comprised of, 7 or 8, 9 separate rules, and very complex technical language. And when you're trying to negotiate around issues like this, one of the nice things about the consensus principles was we started without the technical detail, with just a blank sheet of paper and some basic ideas. That was, of course, a whole lot easier to do than when you get in and actually try to make that work in regulatory language. But I was probably sort of most in the middle of the drafting of hearing from all of these folks, and they're in turn hearing from other people, and it was moving at a very fast rate of speed, because we would have hard deadlines where we had to get things to the division. We'd be running things by the division and getting them back, and a lot turning on individual words and phrases needing to be exactly right. And I was looking back through my email some in advance of coming over here, and the email trail is really quite extraordinary. And just in the subject line, I've seen emails come in from Karen. Where is the language on this? Question mark, exclamation point. What happened to that? And it was that way all around. So I think a lot about, for those of you who are students and interested in careers in environmental management, I think about the things that are important to being successful, at least in this part of the world where all of us work. And I don't know how much of it gets taught in schools and in graduate schools, but you can learn all the science and the law and policy and all of that stuff, but there is an art to just how you make all this stuff happen. And some of it is about this drafting, the drafting stage and the details of the language, but an awful lot of it is about interpersonal relations and dynamics and communications. And so John Heisman over here, who ran this show for DWQ, I don't know where John went to school or how he learned how to do what he does, but John, with incredible patience and poise, stood at the front of the room with typically 100 or so people in these rooms for a dozen or so meetings. And you imagine you put yourself in the front of the room, and who knows what's going to come at you. And you've got a whole lot of people with competing points of view and limited opportunity to be heard, and all sorts of personality types of people who are, some are kind of polite and delicate and restrained, and others who are the opposite of that. And so the whole process of how these kinds of consensus comes together is really, to me, quite remarkable. There's a lot of magic to it.
I'd actually like to back up a little bit, because you mentioned something about how do you get everybody on board. And you know, this was a process where we got most of the local governments on board, largely through this Triangle J Council of Government process that Dan was talking about, and through the fact that Jim Wren himself represents about 6 or 7 different jurisdictions. If Jim had not been representing that many local governments, we could have really had to spend a lot of time just going out and selling this, but actually Jim, because he was representing numbers of counties and numbers of very small towns, was able to actually do a lot of that work, I think, in the process of coming to an agreement with the larger group. But there were still some local governments that really were not on board. And I don't know if that was, in part I think that was because we really didn't have the time to deal with all of them. We were doing a lot of work. All of us had other work to do. We couldn't just live and breathe Falls Lake. I deal with land use issues for the city and billboards and you know, development projects and things that have nothing to do with Falls Lake at all. These other attorneys are doing their other work, so we couldn't just, you know, make this our entire mission. So Hillsborough and Orange County, I think Orange County actually did sign on to the consensus principles, but Hillsborough did not. And that was very interesting because even though most of the local governments in the upper watershed had signed on and were comfortable with what was there, at the last minute, Hillsborough sort of threw a grenade into the process and tried to change something that had been fundamental to the agreement of a number of us to the consensus principles, and we had to fight like crazy, actually, to sort of keep what we had gotten. And I don't want to go into the details of what that has had to do with wastewater treatment plant limits, but they were, you know, very important things for the city of Durham, because the city of Durham, in fact, had acted back in the 90s, the 1990s, to improve its wastewater treatment plant process at the cost of $45 or $50 million. So we were actually treating to a higher level than the other wastewater treatment plants, the other 2 in the region. And Hillsborough was actually looking to have everybody at this point make some kind of more equivalent reduction. So, in other words, even though Durham was putting out, let's say, 3 milligrams per liter of nitrogen into Falls Lake, and Hillsborough was putting out 11, they wanted Durham to have to reduce by 20%, and they would reduce by 20%. But, you know, that didn't cut it for Durham. We had already made large expenditures. Hillsborough hadn't. But there were, I think that type of problem illustrates that actually all the players do have differing interests. Sometimes it's not possible to get everybody on board, and as it is lucky that we did achieve the consensus that we did, because I think had we not, some of these rules that were proposed could have been undone at the very last minute. We were able to keep the approach in place that we had agreed to, but only with a lot of effort and arguing at the end.
Well, one of the important things I think came out of the consensus principles was the idea that there needed to be some sort of Falls Lake Watershed Association where the local governments continued the relationship they had going forward. And although that's been an issue of other debates, I do think that's coming together in the form of continuing the work of the Upper Neuse River Basin Association. And for instance, my clients, being relatively small in jurisdictions, there are ways that they can band together to hire stormwater engineers, a contract with an engineering firm to provide stormwater engineering services that would probably be more efficient to do as a group than it would be individually. And these are the kind of things that I think we need to identify going forward, and we also need to keep ahead of the curve on monitoring and that sort of thing in the lake, and working together, in my opinion, is only way any of us can, number one, probably afford to do that in a reasonable way anyway, and number two, have the data accepted so that we're not back where we were when we started with the consensus principles, and that's everyone yelling at each other. If you start working from data that you've been looking at for the last 10 years, and everyone has an opportunity to be involved in it, I think when we get to a stage 2 reexamination, there's much more likelihood that everyone will be comfortable with that data.
I mean, we're working now to develop what would be the monitoring budget. Haywood, Sarah, help me. You know, I would guess we can expect to spend $250,000 to $300,000 a year to simply monitor, sample, gather the data, meet the EPA, DWQ requirements for modeling, and do the amount of modeling that our local governments all want. Because they want more modeling than DWQ needs. They want monitoring that identifies whether or not they are specifically a problem or whether they are being unfairly lumped with other people. And so that's a bigger cost of monitoring, and we're committed to doing it together. Raleigh, right now, under the formula we have, pays about 35% of the cost of the association. Our footprint in the lake is less than 0.1%. Our interest is, of course, the quality of the drinking water. So we're willing to bring the largest single amount of money to the table in this process because we think those answers are very important answers, and we have to do it together. And if we go separately, and we went separately, as we were looking closely at the modeling process that DWQ had done, Raleigh hired its own modelers, Durham hired its own modelers, and we both were probing the modeling process that DWQ had done to see whether we thought it was adequate. And there had already been some peer review done through modelers that had been hired by DOT, who was also very interested in the results of this process. So we had a lot of separate money being spent, and we recognized the importance and value of spending that money together and the importance of the information if we gather it together and take it back to DWQ and the EMC for the stage 2 decision. So I think it's a critical process that we have just begun, and we're working right now with Sarah and her association on rewriting the bylaws to change the composition and complexion of that association so that it's less advisory and more in the weeds, if you will, about getting this stuff done and looking at the future. In 10 years, 2021, the relook sounds a long way away. It will take at least 5 years of monitoring data alone. It will take 2 years probably to have a satisfactory model run that everybody accepts. And then we're on the cusp of a new decision. It takes 2 years to change the rules once you get the information agreed to and you start the process of changing the rules. There's 9 years by itself with no slippage. And so it's an immediate issue when you understand it in the time frame that all of this takes to work through.